everybody. Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. As always, I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And I know I have blue eyes, but if you see the extra blue in my glasses, we're just trying to sort out some new lighting and new green screening with some new software. So bear with us. Hopefully that won't last forever. But today we have a little bit of a fun one for you guys. And hopefully this is the first of many in this little series. But we're going to do a Q&A episode today. So we put up a story on Instagram a while ago and asked for people to write in questions. Alex has not read any of these, so he will be reacting to them in real time. But we would like to keep doing these because they're kind of fun and they give us ideas that we may not have thought about before. So if you guys have questions like this, please either reach out to one of us through email, Instagram, drop them in the comments below, however you would like to do that. But I'll read off the first one. This one comes from Mike Corso on Instagram, and it says, can you provide tips for single strobe shooting and separately long-term equipment storage advice for those who don't get to dive weekly? Thanks.
Okay, well, those are two very different topics.
Yes.
So the long-term equipment storage, I think, is one of the things that actually causes more trouble with underwater gear than anything else. I feel that I have far less issues with my underwater photography gear than the average photographer. And it's not because I'm some super loving user. I'm probably one of the worst, in terms of regular maintenance. But the fact that I'm regular diving the gear often keeps it in much better condition than the guy who comes away with me, one summer in the Red Sea workshop and then doesn't really dive again until I see them the next summer. They often are having more issues than me using that gear through that period. So I think long-term storage and long-term gaps from diving are really important. I think the first thing that I would do if you're planning a long gap from diving is to make sure you get all that salt out of the system. So at the end of a dive trip, when you know it's a long time till you're diving again, fill the bathtub up with water, good 24-hour soak in that bathtub to really get the salt out off the housing if you can. I usually try and put a bit of weight on the rig, either by putting a weight inside it wrapped in bubble wrap to sink it down inside the housing. Obviously, I'm putting the port on it as well to sink it down inside the housing. Or if I've got a weight belt on a weight belt with the belt, I'll just put the weight belt over the top of the housing to hold it down on the bottom of the bathtub so everything's in there. And every few hours, I remember, I'll go in, press all the buttons on the back, twiddle the dials and everything, try to move everything that moves to get the fresh water into there and to help get the bath out. And then after that, get everything out, wipe off all the droplets. I think that's particularly on the optical surfaces, it's a really good habit to have, even after every dive. I am not, I clean my O-rings almost never. I, don't fuss over my housing at all, but I do clean the optical surfaces a lot. People, I don't do anything else after dives. I don't, put wet dome port covers back on dome ports and make sure those dome ports are dry. And I don't take my dome port cover in the water. My dome port cover generally for me is a dry cover, and I keep it dry and it's on dry. And if it's not dry or if it's got salt on it, I'll soak it and then dry it before it goes back on the housing. Just as a slight aside. But after a good soak in the bath, I definitely dry everything as well as you can. A lot of those push button controls can really hold water. So I usually get a bit of just tissue paper, and I'll hold the tissue paper and push it over all the buttons. And as you push them, a bit of water comes out. And if you're holding tissue paper over the button, the tissue paper absorbs that water. So you get the water out. I usually give my housing a little bit of a shake as well. I tend to turn it upside down and just give it a little bit of a shake. Not like, I'm going to try and break this thing, but just a little bit of shake. And that tends to also get the water out of all those difficult places. I'd then probably leave it to air dry in the house, assuming you've got a dry house, for, 24 hours again, just to make sure it's really dry, and then store it away. And I would say, in terms of main underwater photography gear, it's generally all made of glass and metal and acrylic. Those things aren't going to deteriorate if they're dry and salt-free. They're generally going to stay fine. It's usually suggested when you're doing long-term storage to take the removable O-rings out of any O-ring space that, for me, is not a circle. So if your port is a circle, I don't take the O-rings out of the circles. A circular shape of an O-ring is stretching the O-ring slightly in all the same directions. I tend to leave those in. But any back of housing with wiggly shapes or anything that's not a circle, even if it's an oval or something like that. I think it's good to take the O-rings out of that. And generally, I tend to grease my O-rings and then I leave them inside the object that they're in. And that's really because I don't want to go off on my next trip and they're sitting in some plastic bag in the cupboard at home. I keep them inside things. So if I clean the O-ring of a strobe, I'll clean the O-ring, fold it in half, push it down inside the battery compartment, close the battery compartment with the O-ring inside. So I know I'm not going to forget it on the next trip. And beyond that, I would say that's what I do. I know that the housing manufacturers want you to rub oil on their housings and all. I'm not going to bother with that. So, I think so. Yes, they all have different things they recommend that you do to keep your housings looking tip-top shape. And I would love my housing to look box fresh on every dive. I do like my gear to look new, but I don't care too much when it doesn't. I know some people like their gear to look old and used because when they get on the dive boat, they're not going, ha, look how much money I just spent. They're going, ha, look how much diving I do. So, for me, I would definitely say that's my general procedure. I'm bound to have forgotten something with you springing the questions on me, Matt. So have you got anything to fill in the blanks?
No, I was finding that as useful as I'm sure Mike was, because I mean, fortunately, I dive regularly, at least here locally, so
And
I
you do a
don't
lot
have
of
to worry about
freshwater
long-term
diving as
storage.
well. So,
Yeah, so which is even nicer because then I don't have to clean anything.
mm.
But that trick about taking the O-rings out and leaving them in whatever the thing is, that's a good idea. I'd never thought of that before.
Yeah, people say put them in Ziploc
That makes
bags and
sense.
things like that, but I don't bother with that. It's just, I'm going to clean them again before I put them back in. So
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
happy to just leave
And
them
you're right.
inside.
You're right. It would be I would do something like take the O-ring out, put it in a bag, and then forget that I didn't grab my housing O-ring before a trip, and then you're screwed.
Yeah.
So yeah, leaving it in there is a good idea. But Mike's other question was about single strobe shooting. I feel like we could probably do an entire episode about that. So maybe we'll save that for a separate thing, unless there's something really quick you want to touch on with that.
I think the two things I'd say about single strobe shooting is one, it's a really good thing. I think that just because you own two strobes, as a general comment to general underwater photographers, it doesn't mean that you should shoot everything with two strobes. And as I've said many times, on my macro workshops, I really sort of make it almost compulsory that people do a single strobe dive early in the trip. This isn't because I want people to dive with single strobe all the time, but it's about remembering to turn one off a lot of the time when shooting because just lighting everything with two strobes is not the way to go in underwater photography all the time.
Yep.
I often see underwater photographers overcomplicating things these days by going, "Oh, this was a 4-strobe macro shot," and it's like only one of the strobes is doing any work here. You could have done exactly the same thing with a single strobe. So shooting regularly with a single strobe is really important. A good rule of thumb, certainly for macro with a single strobe, is strobe above the port, sort of about a fist length apart, pointing forward is pretty good for most macro shooting. Angle it slightly down if the subject is really close. But you don't need to aim the middle of the strobe at the subject because remember, strobes have very wide beams. And so actually like that, you get a nice downward light. It creates a nice little drop shadow, a bit like the lights here are creating under my chin, under the subject. And that just pops the subject off the background, which is really nice. If you are going to dive with single strobe, I always use a double arm section on a single strobe, even if it's going to end up back in front at the top of my port, because that allows me to swing it one way, swing it the other way. And it's when you move that single strobe around that you start to see what the light is doing. Matt does seem to have frozen. So I'm just going to break a sec and move back in a sec with an unfrozen Matt. Surprising. Right. Single strobe for wide angle is less commonly done, but can still be really effective. The limitation of using single strobe for wide angle is typically when subjects are close. When your subject is further away and far away in underwater photography, I mean beyond arm's length away, single strobe actually does a very good job for wide angle. And most modern strobes, certainly if they're good quality strobes, have actually got enough coverage to cover most of the frame of a wide angle shot. And certainly when you're working with bigger subjects, further away subjects, bigger animals or further away subjects, which aren't coming right on the dome, that are just, staying beyond that arm length reach, a single strobe actually does a perfectly good job of lighting them and can be very effective for a number of subjects. Again, I would start with a central strobe position, but instead of having it sort of a fist width above the port, I would have it quite a bit higher above the port, probably starting about 30 centimeters to a foot above the port, and then if the subject is further away, a little bit higher still above the port. So it's kind of like a dome and a half, width away or something like that, and then further out if it needs to be. Again, pointing straight forward. Remember, it's a very wide beam. By the time you're far away subject, those two, the lens looking this way and the strobe going that way, they're pretty much parallel. You don't need to angle it down. You're going to end up actually underlighting the top of the frame. The limitation comes with, and then you again can move it around. Because it doesn't work so well close, it's harder to shape the light and give it more side light with wide angle because you can't push the strobe forward, otherwise it's going to be in the picture. So it's harder to get an angle with it in wide angle than it is with macro, but you still can a little bit. If I'm shooting, and one thing I didn't say with macro, because we cut out, but it's the same with wide angle as well, is when I say above the port, that means above the port when you're shooting horizontally. When you shoot vertically, again back above the port, you want that light coming to the coming from the top because that's where sun comes from. It makes for more natural looking shadows. You can angle it one side or the other, but for me, if I'm using single strobe for wide angle, I prefer the strobe centrally at the top than one side or the other. One of the frustrations with the Nikonos 5 was that their standard arm that came with the Nikonos 5 put the strobe in one corner of the picture. And that's the worst place for backscatter because that's where your lens sees widest, so you get the most flare and backscatter with the strobe in the corner. But also, it never lit things particularly evenly. It was great if the subject was going that way, and rubbish if the subject was going that way, basically. So central tends to look more natural, tends to look more pleasing if you are using single strobe. Just to re-summarize that, for macro or wide angle, strobe centrally above the port, generally aiming forwards. With macro, you might want to angle it down a little bit at times, and if the subject is far away, it lifts up and goes further above the port. If it's a vertical, the strobe is at the top, and if it's horizontal, the strobe is at the top, but you're obviously moving it to keep it at the top in both situations. And the same with wide angle, but wide angle, you're starting a little bit further out. The limitation with single strobe for wide angle is that you can't light subjects that are too close. You just get too much of a side light effect, too much of one side of the subject lit, one side really dark, horrible, ugly shadow. So unless it's a specific effect where you want that, that Beatles Hard Day's Night look where half the face is lit and half isn't, generally single strobe for wide angle isn't a good solution for normal lighting, only for extreme effects. But I would encourage all underwater photographers, even if you have bought two strobes, to have a go at shooting single strobe regularly, because it gives you a great control over light. And there are lots of subjects out there that look great the less you light them, and it can be an artifact on a shipwreck. It could be a school of glassfish in a moody cave. It could be something like a really interestingly shaped sponge that you want to reveal the shapes and textures of. And for macro, loads and loads of subjects, particularly on the seabed, look great with single strobe.
Yeah, I was about to say a lot of stuff that lives on the bottom is very well camouflaged into the bottom. So if you light them with a single strobe, you can create shadows that separate them from the background and things like that. I was actually doing it with an octopus yesterday, lighting it from one side and getting some nice separation against the ugly sand. And that's it, like you said, bringing out textures and contrast with a single strobe that's one of the best things about using just one. Because you can reveal some textures and contrasts and shapes that you don't really get otherwise if you're shooting two.
Yeah, and it really drives you down that path of photographer. I've lent some old strobes to a friend of mine who she was out. We've got loads of octopus off the south coast of the UK at the moment. It's very unusual to see octopus in the UK, and there's been this big bloom of octopus, big recruitment of octopus this season, or potentially last season overwintering, and now as adults this season. And she was saying that she shot this octopus and one of her strobes died, and she was annoyed at first, and then actually was quite pleased with the way the lighting was looking. But she still wanted to borrow a strobe just to be on the safe side. But yeah, it makes the point that we often, as underwater photographers, get so used to shooting with two strobes, we only go to one when we have a problem or something like that, and don't realize how often we should go to one when we're not having problems, when just in normal shooting. Right, I reckon we've got time for one more question in this episode.
Oh, we'll make it I have a quick one for you. So my buddy Dan Melee, Said, I've heard Alex say in the past that rubbing a potato on your dome can help reduce water droplets for split shots. Does it matter what kind of potato?
So it's definitely the starch in the potato that makes a difference. So this is kind of a fun thing that just for a laugh, on we use potatoes on liverboard trips, to create a coating on the dome. You can pretty much use anything that's going to give you a little bit of a coating. So, mask defog works perfectly well. Anything that's reasonably to hand, saliva also works reasonably well. But it's definitely the starch in the potato that does something. And the way you do it is you get a small chunk of potato, squeeze the potato, get some juice out of it, rub it on the dome, let it dry, and then give it a quick swish off to get rid of all the bits, and then it's ready to go. And definitely it lasts for about 20 minutes doing a good job, maybe 40-45 minutes doing an okay job, and it's definitely better than an untreated dome through
Yeah.
that period. Is it the cure? Of course it isn't. Anything that's gonna, I think put that little bit of a coating that's not going to damage the dome is quite a good thing. We did it with potatoes simply because I do a lot of split levels on my Red Sea workshops, and there's always potatoes on board from the kitchen, and it is a bit of fun to get the potatoes out. And it started as a bit of a joke that this was the secret weapon, and everyone had a laugh about it. And then, one year, someone was like, "Oh, Alex, can I make a video of you doing the potato thing?" And they filmed the video of me pretending it was some big deal. And it's just one of those videos that went quite viral on it's not like millions of views, but it's hundreds of thousands of views on Instagram. And it wasn't intended ever to get huge numbers of views. It was just a bit of a laugh I put online for friends. So it's become a bit of a bigger thing than is necessary. A few years ago, it's worth mentioning in this conversation that a company did create a really well-researched chemical solution for dome port, to stop droplets. And I forget the name of the product. And it was out about 15 years ago. And it was around for a couple of years and then just dropped out. And it was like a 2 or 3 process procedure where you kind of polished the dome and then applied reagent 1 and then reagent 2. And it made a massive difference. It really did work. And it was really good. But it was just too complicated and no one could, because people are like, oh, I want to do split levels now. Oh, I've got to put this on and leave it overnight and do.
Yeah.
So it didn't really work for people. And I've forgotten the name of it now. And I can't find it online anyway. I remember there was videos about it on YouTube and everything. And it's, they're probably still up, but I've never been able to find them again to remember the name. But maybe someone can write the name of that in the comments. And if it is still on sale, I'll be very happily corrected. But I think it vanished soon after it was sort of first announced. Anyway, I've been people use things like Rain-X, which is a water repellent one. Obviously, buy one that's safe with acrylic if you've got an acrylic dome, or safe with glass. You've got a glass dome, because they make Rain-X for windshields for cars, which are glass. They also make it for motorcyclists' visors, which are acrylic. So you can get Rain-X that's safe for both. But you need to be just slightly careful you got the right one, because I've heard that you can occasionally damage acrylic domes with the wrong type of Rain-X. I've actually, for my Red Sea trip this year, I've actually got a new thing to try on the dome ports, which we're going to try this year. It's a new product, again, designed for windshields. And after the Red Sea, if it works, I'll come back and report on it. But I haven't tried it. I'm not interested enough to actually try it at home. I was going to take it on the trip and try it on the trip, and then if it doesn't work, just bring it back and use it on the car. So
fair enough.
Yeah.
All right. So I know we only got through like 2.5 questions there, but we will have more of these Q&As. We still have some other ones to get through, and hopefully we can source some more as time goes on. So thank you guys for participating. Thank you guys for watching and supporting, and we will see you next time.